Talking about putting a manifestly irresponsible man on national television.
We learned today that Oscar-winning actor Robert Duvall has died at the age of 95. His iconic roles in The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, and so many other movies. And tonight, the role he once said was his favorite. And Al Pacino and Robert De Niro now remembering him tonight.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place when someone truly irreplaceable has gone. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a space so fully inhabited by one person for so long that even the air seems to hold its breath in disbelief. That is the silence that fell over a centuries-old Virginia farmhouse on the evening of February 15, 2026, when Robert Duvall, one of the greatest actors the American screen has ever produced, closed his eyes for the last time at the age of 95. No photographers waited at the gate. No entertainment reporters broadcast live from the driveway. No Hollywood publicist was stationed in the hallway, drafting a carefully worded statement to control the narrative. There was only Luciana, his wife of more than 2 decades, sitting beside him in a room that smelled of old wood and open countryside, holding the hand of a man who had spent nearly 7 decades refusing to become anything other than exactly who he was. When the news finally reached the outside world, it traveled fast. Every major network carried the headline. Every film publication ran its tribute. Every corner of the entertainment industry paused to acknowledge the passing of a man who had shaped American cinema in ways that are almost impossible to fully measure. But even as the tributes poured in, something else was quietly unfolding inside the Duvall home. Something that had nothing to do with awards or box office numbers or Hollywood legacy. The family of Robert Duvall was sitting with a grief so deep and so specific that no amount of money in any estate account had come close to touching it. And there was, by most estimates, somewhere between $50 and $70 million sitting in that estate. The tears his family wept were not about the fortune. They were about the man, and understanding why requires going all the way back to the beginning, to a Navy base in San Diego, to a boy who had no particular plan for his life other than to survive it on his own terms. Robert Seldon Duvall was born on January 5, 1931, in San Diego, California, the second of 3 sons born to Rear Admiral William Howard Duvall and his wife Mildred Virginia Hart. His father was a decorated military man, disciplined and demanding in the way that decorated military men of that era tended to be. His mother was a quieter soul, an amateur actress who loved the stage but never pursued it beyond community theater. In the tension between those two influences, between his father's rigid structure and his mother's artistic sensitivity, the essential character of Robert Duvall was being slowly formed. Growing up as a Navy brat meant growing up without permanence. The family moved from base to base, from one rented house to another, from one school where Bobby was the new kid to the next school where he was still the new kid. He never had the luxury of deep childhood friendships, the kind that root a person in a particular place and a particular community. What he had instead was the ability to observe, to watch people, to notice the small details of how human beings carry themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. It was an accidental education in the very thing that would eventually make him one of the most gifted character actors in the history of film. He eventually landed at Severn School in Maryland, and then enrolled at Principia College in Illinois, where his academic performance was, to put it charitably, undistinguished. He was not a student who thrived in lecture halls and textbooks. He was restless and unfocused, and by his own later admission, he came genuinely close to flunking out. His parents, searching for some way to keep him enrolled and to help him avoid the Korean War draft hanging over young men of his generation, suggested he try drama classes. It was a practical suggestion, not an inspired one. Nobody in the Duvall household was picturing Academy Awards. They were picturing a young man who needed a reason to stay in school. What happened next was one of those quiet pivots that only become visible in retrospect. Robert Duvall walked into a drama classroom, and something switched on inside him that had apparently been waiting his entire life for the right key. He graduated with a drama degree in 1953, served a mandatory year in the Army at Camp Gordon in Georgia, and then made the decision that would determine everything that followed. He moved to New York City, found his way to the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater, and began studying under Sanford Meisner, whose approach to acting was built on presence, instinct, and the radical idea that real performance comes from living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. The circle of students around Duvall during those years reads like a casting call for the Mount Rushmore of American acting. Dustin Hoffman was his roommate. Gene Hackman and James Caan were close friends, 4 young men of extraordinary talent, sharing apartments that barely fit them, eating meals they could barely afford, chasing a dream in a city that was completely indifferent to their ambitions. Duvall worked as a postal clerk, a department store employee, and a truck driver to keep himself housed and fed while he auditioned and was rejected and auditioned again. His first significant screen role came in 1962, when director Robert Mulligan cast him as Boo Radley in the film adaptation of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The role had almost no dialogue. Duvall appeared on screen for only a few minutes, but in those few minutes, particularly in the final scene where Boo stands in the shadows looking at Scout Finch, with an expression that moved from fear to gentle wonder, something unmistakable announced itself. Here was a performer who did not need words to communicate what was happening inside a human soul. He could do it with stillness. He could do it with the quality of his attention, with the way he held his body, with what his eyes chose to say when his mouth stayed silent. A young director named Francis Ford Coppola was paying attention, and he would not forget what he saw. Nearly a decade passed between Boo Radley and Tom Hagen. In those years, Duvall built steadily, and without much fanfare, taking television work and supporting film roles, developing his craft with the patience of someone who understood that there were no shortcuts to the kind of actor he wanted to become. He worked with Coppola on a small 1969 film called The Rain People, and that collaboration deepened Coppola's understanding of what Duvall was capable of doing on screen. When Coppola began casting The Godfather in 1971, the studio executives at Paramount had their own ideas about who should fill the major roles. Coppola pushed back on almost every front, and one of the battles he won was the casting of Robert Duvall as Tom Hagen, the German-Irish lawyer who serves as consigliere to the Corleone family. The role paid Duvall $36,000. To consider what that figure meant in the context of what The Godfather became, and what it continues to generate in royalties and cultural influence more than 50 years later, is to understand something important about the early economics of an acting career, even a brilliant one. But money was never what Tom Hagen was about, and it was never what Duvall's performance was about either. In a film populated with explosive operatic performances, Duvall found a different register entirely. Tom Hagen was always the coolest presence in any room. He sat in the corner of the frame and listened while other men raised their voices. He gave advice in measured sentences. He never reached for a gun or raised his fist. His power came entirely from the quality of his mind and the loyalty of his silence, and Duvall rendered that power so completely that audiences understood immediately why Don Corleone trusted this man with everything. The performance earned Duvall his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He returned for The Godfather Part 2 in 1974, this time for considerably more money. Both films are now widely considered among the greatest in cinema history, and Duvall's contribution to both is inseparable from that greatness. When The Godfather Part 3 came along in 1990, Duvall was asked to reprise Tom Hagen once more. He was interested in doing so, but Paramount offered him a salary that was dramatically lower than what his co-star Al Pacino would be receiving, and Duvall, who had never confused being a great actor with being a pushover, refused to accept that arrangement. He told interviewers later that he had no objection to Pacino earning more. Al Pacino was worth every dollar. What he objected to was being paid a fraction of what his co-star earned for a role, without which the entire film's family dynamic would be structurally compromised. He walked away. The film was made without him, and the overwhelming critical consensus holds that the absence of Tom Hagen is one of the primary reasons the third film never reached the heights of the first two. That decision cost Duvall millions of dollars. He knew it would when he made it. He made it anyway because for Robert Duvall, self-respect was not something he was willing to negotiate away at any price. What followed the Godfather years was a body of work so consistently adventurous and so stubbornly individual that it stands as one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American film. Duvall was constitutionally incapable of taking the safe route. Every time his career gave him the opportunity to settle into a comfortable, commercially reliable lane, he turned left instead. In 1979 came Apocalypse Now, Coppola's hallucinatory masterpiece about the Vietnam War, in which Duvall played Lieutenant Colonel Bill Kilgore with such outsized, terrifying charisma that the character became one of cinema's most indelible portraits of American military mythology colliding with moral catastrophe. The performance earned him a BAFTA award and a Golden Globe, along with another Oscar nomination, and produced one of the most frequently quoted lines in film history, the declaration about the smell of napalm in the morning, delivered with such exhilarating, deranged confidence that audiences have been repeating it ever since. That same year, the great Santini gave him his first Best Actor nomination at the Academy Awards for a portrayal of a domineering Marine Corps pilot and father whose relationship with his son is an ongoing collision between love and cruelty. The character drew uncomfortable comparisons to his own father, comparisons Duvall acknowledged with characteristic directness in interviews. He was not an actor who protected himself from the emotional material of his roles by keeping it at arm's length. He went toward it. Then, in 1983, came the role that stands as perhaps the purest expression of who Robert Duvall was as both an artist and a human being. Tender Mercies cast him as Mac Sledge, a country singer whose life has been derailed by alcohol and regret, trying to rebuild himself in a small Texas town through the quiet love of a widow and her young son. Duvall insisted, contractually, on singing every song himself. He composed some of them. He spent months absorbing the world of country music, not as an outsider doing research, but as someone who genuinely fell in love with the form and its emotional directness. When he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for that performance, he walked onto the stage wearing a cowboy-cut tuxedo and told the assembled crowd of Hollywood royalty that what mattered most to him was that Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings had approved of his portrayal. He was standing at the apex of the industry's most prestigious evening, and the thing on his mind was whether three country musicians felt he had done justice to their world. That moment tells you nearly everything essential about Robert Duvall. The Lonesome Dove miniseries in 1989 brought him what he himself described as his personal favorite performance, the character of Captain Augustus McCrae, a retired Texas Ranger of philosophical disposition and magnificent irreverence, who rides through the American frontier with the easy authority of a man completely at home in his own skin. Tens of millions of Americans watched over 4 nights and fell completely in love with Gus McCrae, and through him, with the actor who had somehow managed to make a 19th-century cowboy feel like the most real person they had ever seen on television. And then came the project that revealed the full depth of Duvall's creative commitment, the film that proved beyond any remaining doubt that his relationship to acting was not primarily a commercial one. The Apostle was a screenplay he had been developing for more than a decade, the story of a Pentecostal preacher from Texas whose life unravels and who must rebuild his sense of purpose and faith from the ground up. No studio in Hollywood would finance it. They found it too regional, too spiritually specific, too far outside the mainstream of what American audiences were supposed to want from their movies. So Duvall financed it himself. He invested $5 million of his personal fortune into a film that Hollywood had collectively decided was not worth making. He directed it as well as starred in it, and when it was released in 1997, it grossed more than $21 million worldwide and earned him his 5th Academy Award nomination. The risk had been enormous, the creative reward was complete, and the financial return, while modest by blockbuster standards, validated every instinct that had led him to take the gamble in the first place. 7 Oscar nominations across 5 decades of work, 1 win, for Tender Mercies, more than 130 film and television credits, a career that began when Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House and extended well into the 21st century, including his seventh and final Oscar nomination for The Judge in 2014, when he was 84 years old. The sheer duration and quality of that run is without genuine parallel in American acting. While all of this was unfolding on screen, something quieter and in many ways more revealing was unfolding off it. Robert Duvall was building a life that looked almost nothing like what a man of his wealth and fame was supposed to build. He purchased Burnley Farm in the Plains, Virginia, a property in Fauquier County that had previously been owned by Washington Redskins owner Jack Kent Cooke. The estate encompassed roughly 360 acres of rolling Virginia countryside, featuring a Georgian stone farmhouse that dated back more than 2 centuries, horse paddocks, open pastures, and views that stretched toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. He also owned another Virginia property near Purcellville, an 18th-century fieldstone manor house built by Quakers, which later lent its name to his production company, Butcher's Run Films. While other actors of his stature were maintaining mansions in Malibu and penthouses in Manhattan, Duvall was feeding horses in Virginia and breathing clean country air. He converted one of the farm's barns into a tango dance hall. He kept cattle. He watched sunrises over open land that had not changed substantially in 200 years. He lived the life he actually wanted to live, rather than the life his fame entitled him to perform. And then there was Argentina. His production company generated income. His royalties from decades of film work compounded steadily. He and his wife co-owned a boutique hotel in Argentina. Through careful stewardship over decades, by a man who never chased the big payday when it conflicted with his principles, and who invested in tangible things rather than speculative ones, the fortune that Robert Duvall built reached an estimated value of between $50 and $70 million. He had no biological children. This is a fact that Duvall addressed honestly in interviews over the years without defensiveness or apparent regret. He had been married 4 times. His first marriage to Barbara Benjamin in 1964 lasted more than a decade, and he helped raise her 2 daughters from a previous relationship. His second marriage, to actress Gail Youngs in 1982, ended in 1986. His third marriage, to professional tango dancer Sharon Brophy in 1991, ended in 1995, but gave him the lifelong passion for Argentine tango that would eventually lead him to the encounter that changed everything. In the late 1990s, Robert Duvall was in Buenos Aires. He wanted to buy flowers. The flower shop he intended to visit was closed. He walked into the nearest open establishment, which happened to be a bakery, and standing behind the counter was a young Argentine woman named Luciana Pedraza, who was approximately 41 years his junior, and who, by her own later account, genuinely did not recognize him. They discovered, at some point in that first conversation, that they shared the same birthday, January 5th. He was born in 1931. She was born decades later on the same date. They dated for several years before marrying in 2005, and the life they built together on that Virginia farm was by every available account one of genuine partnership and mutual devotion. They danced tango together. They traveled between Virginia and Argentina. They founded the Robert Duvall Children's Fund, which worked to build schools and hospitals for children living in poverty. They talked about adopting but never did. The farmhouse was full of life and full of love, but it would leave no biological heirs. When Robert Duvall died on February 15, 2026, the entirety of that $50 to $70 million estate, under the standard provisions of Virginia inheritance law as they apply to a surviving spouse in the absence of children, was positioned to pass to Luciana. There was no announcement from attorneys. There were no competing claimants making public statements. There were no estranged family members appearing on morning television programs. The silence around the Duvall estate in the days following his death was, in its own way, a final testament to the kind of life he had constructed. The family statement released in the immediate aftermath of his passing asked for no formal funeral, no Hollywood memorial service, no gathering of industry luminaries to speak at a podium about his legacy. Instead, the family asked only that people who loved Robert Duvall honor him by watching a great film, by telling a story around a table with people they care about, or by taking a quiet drive through the countryside. It was a request so understated that it almost felt like a provocation. This was a man with 7 Oscar nominations, one of the most celebrated careers in American film history, and a personal fortune that most human beings will never approach in several lifetimes. And his family's parting wish on his behalf was that people go watch a movie and talk to each other. That request was not accidental. It was not modesty performed for public consumption. It was the last coherent expression of a philosophy that had governed Robert Duvall's entire life, the conviction that the things which actually matter are simple, human, and irreplaceable, and that no amount of ceremony or spectacle can substitute for them. Al Pacino, who had worked alongside him in 2 of the most important films ever made, described him simply as a born actor. Francis Ford Coppola, the director who gave him Tom Hagen and Bill Kilgore, and who understood perhaps better than anyone what Duvall's particular gifts were capable of producing, spoke about losing someone essential to his own creative history. Viola Davis, representing a generation of actors who came after him, described being in the presence of his work as a genuine experience of awe. The tributes came from every corner of the industry, and from every generation of filmmakers and performers, and together, they painted a portrait of a man whose influence on American acting is both enormous and almost impossible to fully quantify. But perhaps the most honest tribute of all was the one encoded in the family's simple request, because what it revealed, to anyone willing to sit with it long enough, was that Robert Duvall had not spent his life accumulating things. He had spent it accumulating moments. The moment on stage at the Oscars when he talked about Johnny Cash instead of about himself. The moment of decision when he walked away from The Godfather Part 3 rather than accept terms he considered dishonorable. The moment in that Buenos Aires bakery when a closed flower shop redirected the entire course of his personal life. The decades of mornings on a Virginia farm, watching horses move through fog in the early light, with nowhere he had to be, and nothing he had to perform. He once remarked in an interview that a letter Marlon Brando had typed and sent him after The Godfather meant more to him than his Oscar. Let that settle for a moment. A man with 7 Academy Award nominations, one of the entertainment industry's most coveted symbols of recognition sitting on his shelf, and the thing that moved him most deeply was a private letter from a peer who had recognized something real in his work. That tells you everything about where Robert Duvall's sense of value lived, and it was nowhere near a trophy case. The fortune he left behind is real, and it is substantial, and it will provide for Luciana with complete security for the rest of her life. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary thing, and it stands as proof that a man can hold to his principles across an entire career, walk away from deals that insult him, invest his own money in projects that the industry has rejected, and still emerge with the financial security to leave the people he loves.